Some elements within the Indonesian government did initially resist efforts to redress the November 12th tragedy. That's obvious. They wanted to confront international opinion by whitewashing the Dili episode. But those forces would likely be reinforced by a response on our part which denigrated what President Suharto has done, contrary to those efforts. If Indonesia were a human rights pariah, which had ordered a massacre, or if it had produced a whitewash in disregard for world opinion, an argument for demonstrating our opprobrium by cutting off security and economic assistance would be more understandable. But that is not the case. The Indonesian government has accepted that the November incident was a tragedy. It has taken responsibility for the actions of its troops. It has already announced punishments for some senior military officers preparing to bring other wrongdoers to trial, and is working to ensure that such violent use of force by its troops does not recur. It seems evident that continuing cooperative engagement, not retribution, best serves the human rights goals we all seek. Our human rights dialogue continues, and our welcome access to senior officials in Jakarta is particularly important when it comes to lobbying effectively on human rights issues. As discussion in this forum apparently is going to include the United States' response to Indonesia's invasion of 1975 and incorporation of the province in 1976, I'll mention a few relevant aspects of the historical record as well, expanding a bit upon what Professor Steiner said. After the April 1974 leftist coup in Portugal, Lisbon decided to rapidly decolonize its overseas empire. This resulted in widespread chaos, civil conflict, and foreign intervention in Portugal's former colonies. When the new Portuguese government in 1974 decided to decolonize, East Timor was completely unprepared for self-governance. 4 centuries of colonialism had left East Timor with 1 high school, fewer than 10 college graduates, and a literacy rate under 10%. Portugal and Indonesia held discussions about the colony's future, but a civil war erupted before any agreement was reached. The combatants were Fretilin, which sought immediate creation of an independent Marxist state, Apadeti, which advocated immediate integration into Indonesia, and UDT, which preferred a gradual decolonization process. Portugal's leftist government abruptly withdrew in August 1975, handing over to Fretilin weapons which were then used to gain the upper hand. In the face of an imminent Fretilin military victory and the declaration of an independent Marxist state, Indonesia invaded in December of 1975 and indicated it did so at the request of the East Timorese factions opposed to Fretilin. So when the world turns its attention to East Timor in the mid-1970s, the choice was stark: Marxist Fretilin or Indonesia. While neither had a mandate from the ballot box, there was no middle ground between them. And the political context is significant here. Fretilin military action in East Timor occurred amidst active communist insurgencies in much of Southeast Asia, as the U.S. was departing from Vietnam, and with memories of a communist threat to Indonesia in the 60s still fresh. Non-communist governments everywhere in Southeast Asia were fearful of attempts to topple them. In assessing Indonesia's actions, it's also important to recall that since President Suharto rose to power in the mid-1960s, Indonesia has not had an expansionist agenda. East Timor is the only addition to what was once Dutch colonial territory. In the minds of Indonesian leaders, whose bedrock principle is the unity of their archipelagic country, once East Timor had been incorporated, its standing became a symbol of the integrity of the nation. Those leaders look at the hundreds of distinct ethnic groups and languages within Indonesia, and at the presence of several major religions. They recall regional rebellions from the 1950s, and they fear that loosening even one thread of the national fabric could stimulate other secessionist threats. Within this historical framework, in 1976, U.S. policymakers decided to accept Indonesia's incorporation of East Timor as an accomplished fact. They judged that nothing the United States or the world was prepared to do could change that fact. And U.S. interests with Indonesia, including a human rights dialogue, were important and should continue. With such reality in mind, previous administrations, including the Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush administrations, fashioned a policy which has been followed consistently on a bipartisan basis. We accept Indonesia's incorporation of East Timor without maintaining that a valid act of self-determination has taken place. Since 1976, we have maintained a constructive dialogue with the Indonesian government designed to promote the well-being of the people of East Timor. Included in this has been an ongoing human rights dialogue, as I mentioned. Politically, we support discussions between Indonesia and Portugal under the auspices of the UN Secretary General. We believe such a dialogue continues to be the most promising avenue for resolving the East Timor issue. We are pleased that a dialogue between Indonesia and Portugal at the UN Human Rights Commission meetings in Geneva led to a constructive and balanced chairman's statement concerning human rights in East Timor. Economically, our constructive relationship with Indonesia has allowed us to extend assistance to all Indonesians, which especially benefit East Timorese. On a per capita basis, we have provided more than twice as many AID project dollars to East Timor since 1988 as to the rest of Indonesia. Additionally, Indonesia has, on a per capita basis, funneled over 6 times as much of its own economic development budget into East Timor as to any other province. In 1991, East Timor received about $170 million in Indonesian government grants. That is almost exactly in nominal terms 100 times the average yearly development expenditure for East Timor in the last days of colonial rule. The results of that investment are striking, as Ben Anderson pointed out. In 1974, after 4 centuries of colonial rule, East Timor had only 47 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, 1 high school, and no colleges. Now it has 574 elementary schools, 99 middle schools, 14 high schools, and 3 colleges. In 1974, East Timor had 2 hospitals and 14 health clinics. Now it has 10 hospitals and 197 village health centers. In 1974, East Timor had 100 churches. Today it has 518. In 1974, East Timor was plagued by endemic poverty. Today, poverty certainly remains a problem, as it does elsewhere in that part of Indonesia. But starvation is extremely rare today. The missing economic element is sufficient employment to fulfill rising expectations of newly educated youth. But new business ventures insist on a peaceful environment, and that remains problematic until the East Timor issue is fully resolved. Thanks.
Well, in accord with decisions about division of labor, I'm going to shift the focus from Southeast Asia back to the United States. I want to talk a bit about government policy towards Indonesia and the Indonesian aggression in East Timor in particular. And I also want to talk some about how all of this has been presented to the American public. And I want to mention a little bit about a broader context in which I believe that what's been happening, which indeed is one of the great atrocities of the 20th century, can become intelligible. Well, let me begin with New York Times. On April 16th, 1992, Paul Lewis, their UN correspondent, he's writing about sanctions against Libya. And he says that the sanctions against Libya show how the collapse of communism has given the UN the cohesion needed to enforce its orders. That was impossible in earlier crises, like Indonesia's annexation of East Timor. That is, when Indonesia annexed East Timor, the UN just couldn't get its act together because of the disruptive commies who were around, but fortunately now they're gone. Well, you already heard a somewhat different picture of that given by the U.S. ambassador, Daniel Moynihan. I'll repeat it. Moynihan's picture was the following. The United States wished things to turn out as they did and worked to bring this about. The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective in whatever measures it undertook. This task was given to me, and I carried it forward with no inconsiderable success. He adds that within 2 months, some 60,000 people had been killed, quoting Moynihan still, 10% of the population, almost the proportion of casualties experienced by the Soviet Union during the Second World War. You'll notice there's no ambiguity there about the disruptive force. The Times constantly does discuss Daniel Moynihan and international law. He's regularly lauded there for his lifelong dedication to international law and opposition to aggression and so on.